I last saw him on, I think it was September 20th, just a few weeks before his death. And I knew he'd been away from the court with illness, but he was back with great enthusiasm. I had to visit 4 or 5 courts in The Hague that day, and I said, I can't get over to the court till 5 or 5:30. I'm sure Judge Cassese won't be there. And he said, no, he'll stay. And so between 5:30 and 6:30, we met in his office. I noticed that he was pale but extremely energetic, and talking about the things that needed to be done to move the court forward, to resolve issues like whether there would be an absentia trials. But someone that was just like he had always been, the engine, you know, in the vehicle, the person that sort of made it go forward, and that's what we remember.
It's difficult to talk about Nino without, while keeping your emotions. I think that the tribute today was wonderful, but maybe not so much was said about Nino as a teacher, Nino as a professor. So I met him in the European University Institute in Florence. By chance, we were there exactly the same period of time, 1989, 1993. He was the supervisor of my thesis. He had interviewed me at the beginning as a candidate. I was extremely impressed from the first meeting I had with him.
Judge Cassese was president when I just arrived to The Hague, and the first element of our relationship was the language, because my mother tongue is the Italian. So my experience with Cassese was absolutely positive, because he was not a president who don't want to speak with the prosecutor because the common law system, the judges must not have contact with prosecutor, and it was different because it was in the civil law system. The independence of the judges, of the prosecutor, are not contaminated by the report, by the contact you can have.
He was one of the kindest, most sincere and honest men that I've ever met, and I've worked for some well-known people before and since. He was an inspiration to anybody who worked with him or for him, and he was a good friend to all of us. And I never had a boring day in all of the years that I worked in the ICTY, and certainly not in the 4 years that I worked for him. And I can see with everybody whom I've met over the years who has had close contact with him that most people have the same reaction.
I was studying with Professor Cassese at the University in Florence, and I first met him actually when he was working at the ICTY. He was not professor at that time, but I really remember that he was really asking me. One of the first things he asked me I was doing my PhD at that time, is, are you serious about international law? Are you serious? Because if you're serious about international law, then you have to study. You have to stop doing all these other things you're doing.
Well, I have a very special memory that I would like to be remembered on this occasion, and it dates back at around 1998, and I was a PhD student at the time, and he thought that he had to challenge me at some point, and so he asked me to write like an essay, and that's what I did. And as a professor, he was a very meticulous reviewer, so he did revise my paper like once, and then twice, and then the third time, and upon the 4th time, I think I started to look a bit, how can I say, depressed, probably, not really surprised, but it was, and I remember him, you know, looking at me and saying, you shouldn't be, you know, upset at me revising your paper for the 4th time, because the first time I wrote a paper, do you know how many times did my supervisor revise it? I said, well, no, but it cannot have been more than mine, for 11 times. And I said, no, how is that possible? And he said, well, you're Italian, you must know about that saying. But no, maybe you don't know, because it's a saying from southern Italy and you are from central Italy, you know, the division. And I said, what's the saying like? And he said, well, it is, in Italian it would sound like, sound like nessuno nasce imparato, which is at birth nobody is knowledgeable.
He was really a hard worker, and he was he wanted a lot from himself, first of all, and of course from others. So as also someone else was saying during the tribute, he was really demanding in a sense. And I remember when I was working to write some articles or some piece, and he was really generous in helping with corrections, with suggestions, with encouragement. But it was maybe calling you at 7 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. So sometimes it was like difficult to make this understandable to the family members. But at the same time, I always had this impression that it was really looking for to try to have the best from people. So it was really forcing you. Sometimes it was difficult also, but it was forcing you to give the best, to do the best you can in everything you do. Is that if it's an article, if it's a lecture you have to give, if it's anything, if you're correcting a thesis, you have to give your best, and you have to work hard, and again, not losing sense of humor, not losing the joy of doing, the joy of work.
Once he was very angry about me, and it was because during the NATO bombing from Bosnia-Herzegovina, we had, of course, some indication about, particularly about a pilot, an American pilot, who was asking, I cannot bombard because they are civilians. And from the Aviano headquarters, he received the order to go on. And Nino Cassese told me, you must open an investigation against the pilot. Absolutely. I said, I cannot, because the jurisdiction is high politically and military responsible. So a pilot is not high responsible. But he thought it was absolutely important to open an investigation. So that was the only, it was not really conflict, because of course he accepted my, my decision. But I remember that, and that it was what was said this evening about him, that to take a proactive movement for the international legislation.
Most relevant in my life has been his decision in the Tadic final appeal, where he established the rules of joint criminal enterprise, the ways in which people can be held responsible, leaders, sometimes at a great distance from the actual scene of the crime, but by their acts, by their participation in the criminal enterprise with an intent to commit crimes under the statute, or establishing a system that commits those crimes, or even a situation where they're committing one crime and another is clearly foreseeable. People can be held to account, and this has been enormously important when it comes to charging cases of people like Charles Taylor, who I think common sense from the evidence that we show would indicate was responsible for a great deal of what the RUF did in Sierra Leone, that he provided them with training and arms, according to our evidence. We still don't have the judgment in that case, safe haven, other things that contributed to their ability to stay in the field at the same time that they were committing mass atrocities, rape and murder and chopping off of hands and ears and eyes, you know, that kind of conduct. But to hold an individual like that responsible, sort of legal basis, the sort of roadmap for how to do it, was established in that Tadic appeals decision in 1999.
I think what is really striking about him is how he could motivate his students. He was an extremely motivating professor. He managed to transmit the passion he had for international law and human rights. When I arrived in Florence, I wasn't very clear on the title of my thesis. I was one of the youngest students there. And he told me that initially he had doubts because he had Greek students in London of whom he was very disappointed. So the fact that I was Greek was for him not the best guarantee.
I came to the tribunal after having worked as a journalist in Latin America for many years, having lived through civil wars, through coups d'etats, having seen endless atrocities and, needless to say, a history of impunity. So you can just imagine my excitement to discover not only the institution, which was very young, but this very inspiring man. I must say that among the human rights activists that I've met, and I'm sure he would consider himself one, he's been a man without limits, and we've just all learned so much from him.
Working 16 hours a day for weeks on end in the beginning of the tribunal was difficult, but we did it because the fighting that was still going on in the former Yugoslavia was very in front of us. We could see it on TV all the time, but we also, of course, had the reports and everything coming back in. And it was due to him that we still were there after the first 2 years. As you heard today, it was not necessarily the case that the UN thought we were going to carry on for a long time. And basically, in the beginning, it was probably a PR exercise, setting up an organization like the Tribunal to try and assuage the fears of the public about what was happening or not happening in former Yugoslavia.
I think that ICTY was a success because Nino Cassese was president at this tribunal, because international criminal law was with Nino Cassese really implemented, and it is a pity that he left us.
I was, after working for 6 years, almost 6 years, as a prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, was appointed by the Secretary General to become chief prosecutor in Sierra Leone. And I came to the court just as then retired Judge Nino Cassese completed a report for the United Nations and for the Management Committee on issues within the court. And he had some very tough recommendations. He was hard on his fellow judges. His judges, he said, weren't working as many hours as they should. He suggested the importance of taking the sort of management issues in hand, having strong presidential leadership in that court. In the past, they just had an appeals court judge who was not even in Freetown, was a part-timer, and he recommended that the judge should be resident and be there, and that was a recommendation that was adopted. And so many of the things that were implemented as I arrived were a result of his report. But I came to know him even more during this period since I was appointed by President Obama as our ambassador at large for war crimes issues, because one of the tribunals with which I work is the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. So I often saw him when I visited the court and talked about the ways in which the United States, which strongly supports this institution as we do others, could make it possible for this institution to be successful.
Nino Cassese was the person who managed to get the life of the ICTY to continue for as long as it has done, even to now, and it's still not finished, it's still working hard. So it's a unique and remarkable person, and he had an impact on everybody's life whom he came into contact with.
I remember him discussing ideas. For instance, at one point he was suggesting that because there weren't any accused in custody yet, the investigation hadn't been completed, but there was a defense office, perhaps some of these preliminary issues could be argued out, between prosecutor and defense before the judges. And it was typical of his attitude. We're here, we're being paid, we're all dressed up, we've got our ability to deal with these issues. Let's get to work. Let's do it. And we talked about the contribution situation, how this court at the moment with the current contribution from Lebanon not yet forthcoming and needing voluntary contributions, how it was going to be able to surmount that challenge, what we needed to do to be able to accomplish it. And he very much understood that these international institutions, whose decisions need to be decided on the basis of the law without fear or favor, must necessarily, in a world of states, rely on state cooperation and support.
Nino was a father to me, was a guide, was a mentor, someone who was there in the most decisive moments of my life. He pushed me to finish quickly the thesis. He encouraged me to get the work in the Council of Europe in the Commission of Human Rights when it was my first post there, at a time where I was not even looking for a job. When I was offered a job, he told me, "You have to go." I said, "But Professor, I haven't finished my thesis." He said, "Opportunities like that do not happen every day. You will go and you will finish later." And then he was pushing me to do so, and I did everything as he basically wanted me to do.
Upon his passing on, of course, I thought, oh my God, how a knowledgeable man and scholar he had become. And not only that, I mean, he really truly was a source of inspiration, not only for PhD students as I was, but for students to become more and more knowledgeable, I would say, on any human beings related issues. And that's truly a huge legacy that he has left behind.
When I see Andrew Clapton, I met now Paula Gaeta, and I read the words they wrote about Nino, we share all the same feeling. You couldn't work with Nino without really being absolutely attracted by his brightness. He was an extremely bright mind, and at the same time his humility. He was an extremely humble man. He came twice to the Council of Europe to give a speech in the Parliamentary Assembly. And on both occasions, he was so simple, so humble. People would lose him. They were expecting to see a man much more pompous, and I would say, but this is Nino.